Hi, this is Lee, and this episode will sound and look a lot different from all other episodes. Schedules and international time zones with today's guests were hard to align, but because of my excitement to talk with this gentleman, I plan to record this podcast whenever and wherever I could make it happen. It just so happened that I was on vacation in a hotel with no microphone or no camera other than a webcam, so the audio-visual quality isn't my norm, but the value brought in today's podcast with today's guest is unmatched. So I promise you'll learn something that you did not know. Once again, thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast.
You're listening to the Business of Marketing podcast, where we have conversations with some of the most influential and thought-provoking minds in marketing, sales, and business. And here's your host, A.Lee Judge.
Welcome again to the Business of Marketing. I'm A.Lee Judge. I like to consider myself a global marketer, but today I'll admit that perhaps due to the companies I've worked for or the location of my clients, my experience with marketing in Africa has lacked insight. And I aim to fix that today in a conversation with our guest. He is based in Kenya and is the founder of Nendo, a strategy and storytelling consultancy. He's a well-known digital marketing expert, renowned speaker, and entrepreneur. He was named as one of the top 30 under 30 in Africa's best young entrepreneurs by Forbes. His blog on Nendo is a valuable digital marketing resource covering sub-Saharan African mobile marketing trends, social media, storytelling, content marketing, social networks, as well as research. So it's my honor to welcome to the podcast, Mark Kaigwa. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining me today.
Really happy to be here, A.Lee, and really excited to be on the pod. Big fan of what you're up to.
Oh, awesome, man. Thank you. It's an honor to have you here. I want to dive right into by learning about your agency, and maybe in that we can learn more about you as well. And I know on the Nendo website, it says that Nendo started from a desire to see a gap filled. Insights published about Africans by Africans in Africa. I love how you phrase that. So tell me more about that.
Sure thing, A.Lee. So I think for us, part of what we discovered was that, and I guess this is sort of the origin story of the company, is that there was a moment where I discovered that there were people around the world who were looking for great speakers to talk about what was happening in Africa. How that happened was sort of by accident, in the sense of I went, and I won't give you the long story, but I managed to give a short talk at an innovation conference in Norway. My first time there, I basically wrote them a cold pitch, and they flew me out there, surprised the whole audience that, who paid a lot of money to be there. And a bunch of people were like, I didn't know Africa was happening in this way. The fact that you have mobile money, like you're telling me you can pay for stuff faster there than I can pay here with my big, platinum American Express card, everything. And I was like, yes. And I was like, you'll see the Googles, Facebooks, and all these other big tech companies come and take a lot of this tech. And at that point, even PayPal, the biggest corporations, hadn't innovated as fast as Africa. So I was basically seeing this opportunity. So what I found was they were like, well, you know what? You're young. You live in Africa. You seem to not be trying to emigrate here, so you have a return ticket. They were like, I want to find out more of what's going on. But then I started to find out that there was, people who lived in Africa a long time ago. There was people who lived, in the US, UK, England, Norway, who had basically emigrated there. But to find the continent and find things written from here, for here and for the world, that's when I said, hey, Nendo really has to exist to fill that gap. And we've been going ever since with that desire to basically make it to where you could sit in New York and, for example, tech startups in Africa raised, I think, something like to the tune of $5 billion last year, almost $2 billion in the first 3 months of this year. So a lot's happening. People are investing billions of dollars, mainly, like the US, Europe, elsewhere. China's here in a big way. So when you're looking, they have one of two options, right? Fly a bunch of consultants from their city to come here, figure things out, or come and find basically the best minds and ask them what's going on. And Nendo fills that gap to where they can actually find a reliable resource for research, marketing, trends, and most importantly, how to win this African consumer. Because the next 100 years, Africa will be the youngest continent and one with the highest potential in terms of natural resources. and innovation and impact. And so that's why we're really passionate about what we do.
It's so interesting to me that you mentioned that they were surprised that the technology, even the fintech technology, was more advanced, and it was just unknown to them. It's almost like the digital marketing Wakanda, as if
Exactly, and that's it's funny you say that, because for me, like there's a big keynote I gave, and one of the ways I say is I look at how Africa's been covered the last like 25 years, and you have sort of what I call wasteland, which is like the first like sort of decade where it's like lions, sort of diamonds and war, right? It's like these sort of like really really worn out like ideas of you go there for safari, you go there for natural resources, or generally it's sort of this hopeless case where there's war, there's all sorts of basically structural issues. And then there was what I'd call the Waka Waka period, which is, if you remember the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, the eyes of the world went there and they were like, oh my gosh, South Africa, very unsafe, this, that. A lot of like, again, stereotypes, but it was an immaculately put together global feat that had people saying, wait a second, maybe I've fallen for that single story about the continent. And then I love what you said. The third phase is the Wakanda phase. This idea that, we're sitting on this natural resource, what in the Marvel movie they call vibranium. And that's our mind, our intellect, our technology, our customs. And then we're becoming net exporters. If you look at the Billboard Top 100, they had so many Afrobeat songs get in there, get onto the top 10 to the point they said, you know what, fine, we'll give you your own chart. You'll still dominate ours from time to time. But the fact here is that we're becoming a net exporter of stories, social media trends, content, music, and culture, to where Africa, you can't just know it. At least you would hope that people don't just know it for one thing. But thanks to the internet, it's become flat. And so, like you said, fintech is probably one of the leading areas, but there's so much more.
And it's interesting that not only is it a stereotype, but I can tell you from an American's perspective, it's been taught. It's not just like rumor or, from media to movies and entertainment. It's been taught that it's just, what were the three things you said? Like safari and
lions, diamonds, and war. So that's just it's like it's these really worn out ideas that are really. And here's a funny thing: to some extent they are true, but the problem is it's as this famous TED talk of this Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She says that's all true, but it's an incomplete story. And if that's all you buy into, you miss so much of what else we have to offer. And thankfully, at least thanks to content, we're making it hopefully a bit hard to ignore. In music, you could go to a cafe in London or New York, or be sitting in LA, and I mean, Drake just put out an album, for instance, and Black Coffee, this South African producer, is one of the big producers on that. It's like the small little touches where you're getting this feel for where it's like Africa's making itself hard to ignore. And that's the other thing, Africa is not it's not a country, as we say. So it's 54 different sovereign, independent countries. But yeah, we have a lot in common. And ultimately, we're just trying to, again, reframe the narrative.
So tell me this, as I admitted earlier, that I myself have a gap in understanding marketing from an African's perspective. So tell me, comparing to a global perspective, what are some of the nuances that make marketing in Kenya or Africa different?
I'd say that there's a lot of principles that ring the same. I mean, when I think about what makes an exceptional brand, or we look at the marketing effectiveness world, I'd say that the principles in many ways are similar, but some of the expressions are different. So what I mean by that is, like, you take a lot of global corporations, they're saying, hey, look, we've reached essentially saturation in somewhere like the US. I mean, even a corporation like Meta or Facebook or whatever, they know that there's, essentially 300 something odd million Americans. I mean, the continent has 1 billion people, right? So they know the next decade, even as, maybe you will say teenagers aren't joining, Facebook or whatever, here, everything is still right. And now you multiply that, right? You take the big corporations out in Silicon Valley, or you take the sort of global multinationals across the US, they're keeping their eyes saying, hey, you know what? If we don't address or participate in what's happening in Africa, and this is a marketing challenge, because you can't just roll out this red carpet and think because you're some big brand, it's just all going to fall down to you. Why? There's great African brands, or for example, diaspora, who are coming back to the continent saying, I've been in the US, I've worked on Wall Street, I've been in these corporations, and now I want to go back. I've been sending money back for like a decade plus, or, we've got multiple generations of us here in the US, but we keep our links back home. We want to go back and develop. And so they're bringing this injection of ideas and best practices. Now, what makes the continent unique? is I would say that in Africa, I'd say that as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention, meaning that we don't exactly have a lot, right? So this idea even of consumerism, people can be quite sharp and clear on their spending or quite delicate with how they go about consuming. I'll give an example. So we have something in Kenya we call the Kadogo economy. So Kadogo means small in Swahili. And the idea here is that there's an entire ecosystem that typically goes off the radar of the fast moving consumer goods, or what I think in the US is known as consumer packaged goods, CPG, that industry. Mm-hmm. And basically it's where you can buy toothpaste by the squeeze. You can sort of buy like cooking oil by the scoop. And so there's this entire like sub economy where essentially it's worth billions of dollars, but it's incredibly unstructured. Mm. So that's the interesting thing about it, is that you have these really small shops, like we're talking like small, like the size of, like the width of my hands here. But they'll be serving and turning over a volume in terms of retail that'll make them hard to ignore, especially so instead of the bodega or the corner store, you have that. Now, when you come online or you go offline, no matter what the brand is, so you take tech, you take banking, you take insurance. One other thing I'd say, besides things like the Kadogo economy, you have these sort of daily consumer decisions that get made. And as a marketer, you have to win in that moment at the point of purchase. You have another opportunity, I would say, which is just creating tech that helps people leapfrog. And so what I mean by that is that here, a lot of the luxuries that are there. So I'll give you an example. In the US, it was, there was AOL CD-ROMs and all of these different like circumstances that allowed people to come online over the years, right? Mm-hmm. So it was first at home, and then on a PC, and then on a computer and laptop, etc. Here, we skipped a lot of that to go straight to the mobile phone. And then on top of the mobile phone, so many things have been built that it's completely disrupted the idea of even what a bank is or what a financial services company is. So we have a lot of almost innovative and unique opportunities being carved out here, like I said, that we then exported. So you look at certain ways that something like like Kenyans sometimes will just laugh and say, like we look at Venmo or we look at these, American corporations, like it took you how long to do that? Like we were doing that back in the early or mid 2000s, because that's who we are. We leapfrog what's typically a 10-year journey with a lot of infrastructure and heavy costs. And it will be similar, in the US, let's say there's 5G, and we're not there yet with 5G just yet. Mm-hmm. But when we get there, trust me, I'm telling you, A.Lee, the things we'll be able to do and the ways it'll be able to impact the economy will now create their own set of opportunities. So that's what's so exciting about here, is that you have both this opportunity for invention and then this incremental innovation that's happening, whether it's like at the really, really small level, because the truth about it is, economically, Africa has some challenges in the sense that, society-wise, income-wise, earning-wise, institution and governance-wise, we still have some ways to go, right? Especially a range of the countries here. But potential-wise, we're unrivaled and unmatched. That's the exciting thing about it.
What's interesting to me about what you said was that, so brands outside of Africa they need to be careful about how they approach the market and not underestimate the African market. And they need to learn how to correctly approach that market, because it sounds to me that, especially with time, that market may not need them. It may not need outside companies, because at the same time, there are companies and technologies developing within the continent, in the countries, where we as in outside of Africa or US, maybe learning or needing not only historically, like it was the natural resources, but also needing the technology resources, and definitely the population of consumers will be needed. So it's really interesting for me to hear that perspective.
Absolutely, and I think part of what makes it interesting being here is that it's always so intriguing how you like I still watch. We have clients in the US, for example, as Nendo. We have clients in Europe, and we very much see ourselves as a global or Pan-African organization, even though like we're based out of Nairobi. Like even right now as we speak, we've got campaigns happening in because the continent is, like I said, pretty big. So we have francophone countries that speak French predominantly. So we have some marketing campaigns happening there. And there's certain nuances and differences there in how they see the world, how they speak, how they see themselves. You've got Portuguese speaking countries here, and we have some cafes going on there in addition to research projects really all over the show. And really, that diversity of both opportunity and of learning is humbling in a way, because that's the idea is, you have obviously the McKinseys, the Big Fours, all these big corporations that come here and say, look, we're going to pitch up shop, and anyone who's expanding this way, will knock on our door. And here's the funny thing: it's Africans who are actually there speaking for what's happening and what the opportunity looks like. From a marketing perspective, I still feel the place that I'm passionate about seeing more learning happen is starting what counts as effective marketing here. There's been a bit done, but I'll give you an example. I think in the global Diageo, in the sort of wine, spirits, and the alcohol industry, I think some of their most profitable, I think, brands of the last couple of years, and certainly some of their best business decisions have taken place here with the launch of a brand that was, I think there's one in particular that's coming to mind. So basically, it's there is high risk, and having that tolerance for risk and that appetite to see something new. Here's the thing: you could be sort of one of, let's say, like 10 or 20,000 in the US, or one person of 500 in your state. And you could come here. Obviously, it's not exactly an equivalent, but by studying the environment, collaborating, and really empathizing and connecting with what's going on here, you could really make a pretty big impact here. So that's the thing is, for me, I'm not just like evangelizing the content to attract investment, but also saying really that it takes a process of patience and really connecting with what's going on here, and respecting the fact that our journey might not look like one overseas.
I'm guessing that this is a problem that you face a lot, and maybe your company solves, but here in the States, oftentimes, especially the larger the corporation, they have serious cultural fails when they're trying to market to a culture. The American culture is very diverse, but corporate doesn't always recognize that. And because of that, they may make offerings or have campaigns that horribly fail, maybe even insult certain cultures. I'm wondering, is that something that Nendo can do to help, foreign countries who want to market into Africa? And also, have you seen examples of companies outside Africa trying to market into Africa and have some fails?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's, how much time you got, A.Lee? Yeah, I think there's a few. I mean, oftentimes, I'll give you an example from right now, and this is a bit tricky, but I'll say it. So I'll say that there's a U.S. talk show host that just spoke about Kenya and spoke about it in very disparaging and negative terms. So, on one of the big TV networks, said that, the US, we don't want to be like places like Kenya where pregnant women can't vote. Now that was, again, a little soundbite. And let me tell you, like, A.Lee, right now, if you go onto like the Kenyan Twitter trending topics, like, you literally have tens of thousands of Kenyans who put all their, because we're about to go to an election, they put all their political differences aside and said, look, I know we haven't agreed on much, but this lady at this US line network, we need to sort of send a message. And they've done that for a long time. So I'll give another example before looking at brands. When President Obama was scheduled to come to Kenya, another TV network, and I don't want to name them because I don't want people taking this out of context, but they said that U.S. President Obama is going to visit a hotbed of terror. Oh man, did they get it? Like, the Kenya government had a $1 million advertising contract with that global media network. They canceled it. And not only that, there was also, again, like the whole country basically woke up, loaded some prepaid data and said, I'm going to give CNN a piece of my mind. I'm going to find any and all CNN anchors. The most, I guess I've said who it is now, but all these like prominent ones. And then the one from like today or like the last couple of days, someone at Fox News, just showing that it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on. You can be left leaning or right leaning. Like Kenyans generally are so so protective of their perception because they know that already there's this whole the Africa they never show you, and they already know that there's people with such a limited worldview that they're like, the last thing we want is anyone taking anything out of context. Anyway, fast forward that example from a few years ago, and CNN had to send its highest ranking executive outside of, I think, the former CEO, Mr. Zucker, to fly here to go to basically State House where the president stays and deliver an apology, right? Like to these sort of nameless faces of internet users who basically called out CNN. On top of that, I think there was just a moment of reckoning where both presidents and many corporations started to call Kenya a hotbed of innovation, a hotbed of opportunity, a hotbed of investment. So that's sort of on the interpersonal side, and that just tells you a bit about how Kenyans are. Now, on the corporate side, there's been, I think, a number of like these mistakes and faux pas, and I know what you're saying. So I believe there's an airline that came here and had, I think, a photo of their plane landing and some giraffes. And people said, hold up, excuse me, right? Yeah, Kenya is known as Silicon Savannah. You got to talk to us about tech. Like we have technologically driven ideas. We're way beyond sort of the whole safari thing. And you certainly wouldn't advertise to us with that in mind. You can advertise to people in your country about the safari, but for us, you got to give us something else to go on. So I think it is examples like that. And what's the funny thing about it is it's a recurring trend. What happens is basically, you can imagine like if the whole of the US woke up and somebody spoke badly of the US and they're based overseas. And people basically put all their political and ideological differences aside and they say, let's all go and target that. That's sort of what Kenyans tend to do online because there's a way that they take up this idea that the perception of our country is more important than any one of us. And brands are no exception. So they put brands in check for whatever mistakes they make. And even local brands are held to account. Like if it's a multinational with a campaign they don't feel is representing the country well or is speaking to a particular demographic, like you said, they'll check them. And that tends to keep brands honest, especially multinational corporations. And they'll apologize, they'll make all sorts of restitution and say what they need to because they're like, hey, look, we're going to learn, we're going to get better, and we're going to get local people on the ground to be our eyes and ears rather than shipping things off from a global perspective.
Wow, that's fascinating to me because I'm always very interested in, well, of course, we're marketers. We want to understand our audiences and not just from a local perspective or a country or a continent. I want to understand, where are these companies and organizations? It's always interesting when you hear a headline about a fail, like when you hear someone made a major faux pas and your first thought is, well, who was in the room? Who let this happen? Or why did they not have enough perspective or diversity in the room for somebody to raise their hand and saying, for this demographic, for this country, for even maybe the whole target audience, this does not work. Is anybody in the room who can actually, vet this out? And I think from just within a nation, let alone beyond one, diversity, now that the world is becoming more global, more companies do work globally. I think companies, even if they're a European-based company, a US-based company, an African-based company, we're getting to a point now where we need diversity in the room from other countries, from other cultures. Because oftentimes I see companies say, well, we're going to have a diversity initiative. We're going to hire more women from the same country, from the same neighborhoods, and they're not really getting an intellectual diversity, let alone saying, well, if we have a global product, is our boardroom, is our marketing team global? Does anybody understand Africa, Europe, Australia before we go to sell to these people? And I think those are probably the roots of a lot of fails.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think with that, the other thing that I like to sort of check, especially with international clients, is sometimes they get the impression that, like a country like Kenya, where I'm sitting in and dialing in from now, and that we're sort of waiting for them to arrive. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is that, and this is sort of like a slightly contentious like topic, but Africa is both determining for itself, and then there's a sort of global race around influence that's seeing China want to make its own sort of presence here. It's seeing Europe want to make its own presence here. It's seeing Britain, since they left the European Union, make its own presence here. Then America, and not even sort of some of the South American countries. So it's this idea that like for the longest time, for instance, I would, like learn about the rest of the world through like a Washington lens, through the Voice of America, through CNN. And then, China starts to say, well, we don't want that. So they come in here and like, oh, Nairobi is going to be our Africa bureau for like our global television network. And even like, same with the BBC. Like, I think they're the largest, essentially, basically newsroom and office outside of London, right? And the BBC is global, right? It's in Nairobi as well. So there's this idea that, hey, we want to control a bit of the narrative, at least influence it. And even business wise, there's some, some things where like, I got, we got Amazon, we got this, that, you name the American corporations. And there's equivalents, either African made, African led, African owned, or in some cases, European funded or European like extensions, or likewise from China. And so it's this idea that no one is sort of waiting for you to come. The opportunities are sort of being taken up and being built, and the infrastructure is. And it's a journey. I think just where, you can't afford to sort of like, in fact, for me, one of my big things I say is you can't afford to not at least get what I say, some Africa in your newsfeed, right? Like, this like with the algorithms, I'm always challenging people. I'm like saying, if you don't see enough about the continent, you need to follow some different creators, you need to follow some different people on YouTube, elsewhere, because you just want it to be, you want the algorithm to be serving you up a bit of that, in addition to what you already like, already know, and already are drawn to, because that's the challenge I'm putting to people. It costs you nothing to find some great creators, read like some of Nendo's trend reports, so I can recommend other people too. Because it's that idea that at least you're just refreshing yourself globally without ever really leaving your, the seat of your chair or your state or your town. So that's always an encouragement for me. And marketers who do that might find that now in this just like what you said, in this diversity of ideas, just simply by making sure I'm drawing on multiple sources, I'm more creative in the Bay Area. I'm more creative in, the Midwest or whatever, because I'm able to cater to these different positions and perspectives, because I'm not just, sticking to what I know and sticking to what I'm used to.
You have just given me an action item. I will do exactly that, to start following more people, to make sure, because you're right. If I look at my feed, it's typically US, Canada, Europe, and some Australia. Other than maybe I don't have much Africa in my timeline. So that is my action item that I'm going to take. I want to tell our listeners that is your action item to take, to find more Africans and put them in your timeline so that you can remove perhaps some of your own biases and learn more about what's going on. Because they're not waiting for us to come to them. They got their own thing going on, right?
Absolutely right.
So I want to ask you this, Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you recently gave a talk on what you call the 22 marketers mindset. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think for me, exactly. So I'm always trying to give these trend talks to set the table really for marketers, communicators, and professionals who have the chance to influence people's perceptions or their buying behavior. That's right.
So in that 2022 marketers mindset, what should marketers be thinking about this year, you think?
So I think for me, if I look at Kenya and sort of speak to Kenya first and then look to the rest of the continent and something that applies to this audience. So Kenya right now is in an election year. In fact, I want to say about 31 days, give or take, we'll be going to the election. And typically what happens as marketers is that I'll give a bit of history. Election years tend to be in such a way that I think the analogy that I've heard is that in a place like the US or globally, you have unpredictable campaigns and then predictable results. So what that means is that you could have so and so leading and so and so leading, and the polls keep changing. But then by the time it's done, there's sort of this declarative outcome, and we see this transition of power, whatnot. On the continent, to some extent, right? And this is part of what makes some of those negative headlines that people get a bit cross about in Kenya and elsewhere. You have what some people call like predictable campaigns and unpredictable results, meaning you just sometimes aren't as sure where it's going to go. And that's that uncertainty with the result and how it'll affect the economy and the business community and by extension marketers. That means that marketers are really hesitant, or they try to have 12 months in the first 6, like what's happened in Kenya this year. So the 2022 marketers mindset for me was, I wanted people to think, you typically don't spend what you usually do in an election year. You tend to be really cautious, especially coming into this time, or you tend to go dark. And I was like, if you're a challenger brand, if you're running a challenger brand, you're not top one, top two or whatever in your category, even if you're number two anywhere else, you need to actually think that this is your time to remain consistent. Why? Because if number one takes a bit of a break, you get better share of voice than you've probably ever gotten with your minimal spend. And that, like people are really sort of coming back to be like that, but don't you know the economy? I said, well, aren't people still consuming? Aren't people still basically, just look at the economy generally. People still want to invest. And obviously we've seen what's happened in the US and we have inflation and everything else. But people genuinely still want to carry out their everyday life and work. And as a marketer, you don't get a lot of windows where this happens. The only other time this happened was COVID, where I remember talking to a senior executive of a media group in Nigeria in a workshop we were running. And she was saying how when one of the biggest telecoms companies gave up their top spots because they pre-book all the primetime spots, she literally saw one of the number three contenders say, I want every one of them. I know everyone is basically not paying you. They said, this is a window I'll never get back. And sure enough, during COVID, and the decision came from South Africa for that telco in Nigeria. So they were like, hey, we're cutting all spend, we're pausing everything, we don't want to advertise. These other guys had some autonomy. So they said, hey, we want to advertise. And guess what happens? The big guys start cruise control, right? Because that's the thing with advertising and marketing is that it's like a plane is what they say, that it takes advertising and marketing spend to get up there, and it takes the actual advertising to continue, even if you're a leader, to stay up. And that's the thing people don't forget. So they say, look, we're number one, we can coast a bit. And frankly, I think the University of Australia and like you said, University of South Australia and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, they've talked about how if you stop your advertising, if you're a big brand, you don't feel it immediately, but you do start losing market share. And so my challenge, at least the biggest one that I was saying, and that's why I'm trying to share something, I guess, unique from our context, is sometimes the whole country takes a collective breath before an election. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but you gotta release that. You still have to take a couple more breaths every minute. And so that was one of the big ones I know that for me I was so passionate about. And I can tell you, A.Lee, there's a couple brands now, because I gave that talk in December of 2021 at a CMO keynote here in Nairobi, in the capital. And I've seen a couple brands actually stick to that. And I mean, they're telling me, hey, the business is doing better than we expected. And I'm like, hey, no surprise. If the big guys step aside and you continue to push, defend your budgets, you'll actually see the growth. So that's one of the ones that really stood out to me that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, I think that speaks not only to the marketers who are listening, but also to the agencies like ours, because we know that our smarter clients aren't letting off the gas right now. I know we're talking recession, we're talking downturn, but the smarter companies are adding to their marketing because someone I spoke to last week, I think it was Ardith Albee, and she was saying that now's the time to put the foot on the gas, basically, because companies don't want to lose market share. And if they get scared coming into recession and they let off the gas, and then they're going to lose market share and those challenger brands are going to take over. You mentioned COVID. I have a client who was preparing for Mobile World Congress in Spain last year. And one of their, I don't know if we would say competitors, but someone in their same space pulled out of Mobile World Congress and let the biggest central booth go from the show. And they jumped in and got the centerpiece. And I'm sure they paid a lot less than that major one did. But the end of the story was they were the challenger brand. They got the biggest shine at the show. And had that company not let off the gas, then they would have held that. So I've seen a few huge examples. Yeah. So let me ask you this. So in your agency, you show a strong emphasis on research and data, but also have creative services. If you had to choose which one should be the most important to marketers, which would it be?
Oh, that's a great question.
Maybe even an unfair question, but
I know. Yeah, in fact, for us, like that it's something interesting. Like you said, I think in the beginning, we've gone through an evolution of how we describe the value we offer brands, because we are, I think in the beginning we talked about strategy and storytelling. That's sort of what we talked about. Then we realized strategy is like selling a vitamin. So not everyone's going to buy it. And suddenly when, they'll buy a painkiller, right? Because they're like, hey, if I got a headache, I'm going straight for, the Benadryl or whatever, like the painkiller of choice, Panadol as we call it, whatever. But the vitamin is like, you're sometimes you're pushing a rock uphill. So when we reframe what we do as at Nendo, we called it agency, which is the marketing side, advisory, which is the strategy side, and academy, which is the training side. And what we realize is, one, with training, we can train competitors. So they can sit in a room, sometimes they'll fold arms and look at each other, but they'll get some really great, learning experience and a knowledge experience from us in a workshop setting. And then typically they'll call us in and they'll have a brief for research or they'll have a brief for some marketing work. And if I had to choose between the two, I would basically say I'm more qualified as a marketer, but I'm pretty passionate about research. So some researchers look at me and say, "You're not a qualified researcher," and I'm like, "Hey, you're right. I'm sort of masquerading on that front because I worked in advertising as a copywriter before. So that's the part that comes naturally to me is copy and creative ideas and campaigns and brainstorming. But with research, what I find is always so humbling is you can't really dictate the outcome, right? We have a bit of sometimes creative control in the process because you take the brand, you try to like have your eureka moment or, just think of how you're going to basically come up with the big idea. In research, you have either a really regimented process that you're trying to follow to get to these insights. And I always say like insights is like, it's like, sort of Kenya has a beautiful coastline and there's a beautiful city. When you come, because we're going to find somewhere to get you over here, A.Lee. When you come, we're going to hit up the coast and maybe that's where we do some trainings and some workshops. But if you're ever under a coconut tree, I always say there's two ways to get the coconut, man. You got to either wait for it to drop or you got to go up and get it. And with insights, you got to go up and get it every time. And I always push my team. I say the insights are not going to just sort of fall by accident. You have to earn them each time. So I won't lie. I'm pretty partial and passionate about the research side. Also because what we find is because Africa has been so mischaracterized, because Africa needs this sort of evidence basis. There's people who make decisions with spreadsheets where they're saying, look, we want to give South Africa, $10 million. We're going to give Kenya $3 million. And sometimes we're like, hey, look, is it research you need, on the middle class, on its growth, on sort of like the category? Because some of the big research companies from the US might not be here, but hey, there's a Nendo here to make something happen for you. And if that helps you to raise basically what we call, that rising tide lifts all boats, that you send a $2 million extra, it helps the TV stations here. It actually helps the digital ecosystem. It helps the influencer marketers here. It basically impacts us when we just make any sort of blip that raises the investment that happens in marketing. So I find that evidence tends to achieve that, whereas marketing's job is to basically deploy that capital and those resources in a distinctive and memorable way to make an impression and sort of win hearts and minds, as it were. So you got me, sort of like caught in two worlds, but I'd probably say the research side excites me because I've watched it make a real difference, even for companies where I didn't benefit, but you could see the impact and it's bigger than any of the work that we've done on the other side.
I ask you that question because, typically I set that question up before I asked the question, but I did it to you this way. I'll ask you the question first, but it's because I see so many agencies, you and I both having agencies. I typically ask when I speak to someone who owns an agency about their thoughts on how when you see agencies advertise as full service, and there's really no such thing because every agency has a key area. They're almost all, I think the best ones are a bit more T-shaped. They go deep in a certain area. Maybe they began somewhere. Maybe they began in research or began in creative or whatever. And that's their core competency. And I like that you frame that what you know what your core competency is, what you like to do, but you also understand and work on the research because it supports the core competency. And, aside from the big global agencies who have grown for years and years to be able to do lots of things, I think it's fair for anybody looking out or seeking an agency to ask the question, what is your core? Where did you come from? So they know they're not, because full service is often a false narrative, I think.
Absolutely. And it's a bit of a cover up. I think you're right. And I say that with the most respect because I have some great colleagues and sort of, industry folks like I imagine you do who they run full service shops. And so I'm always like full service. Yeah. Give them a bit of a wink and sort of say like, hey, you keep that going because us niche players, we want to be a bit agile. We want to try to dominate a category to the point where people would be like, hey, look, I'm going to give you 3 insurance companies. You just set up sort of, as they say, sort of Chinese walls. This team doesn't know what that team's doing, whatever, because you're bringing category experience in delivering certain outcomes, marketing wise, that's distinguishing you over others. And certain organizations, I think in the agency space get really good at that. And I think like for us, like you rightly said, right now one of my big priorities is making sure that we get better creatively speaking. As far as like our big picture, big thinking. I mean, we have a pitch that's going to come soon, and I remember the client looking at me and saying, "Mark, you impressed the CEO with the group CEO with the research side. In fact, that's why you guys have a shot in the first place, because you're going up against the big guys." But they said, if you really want this, I'm going to give you some advice, right? You better go out, because it's not you and it's no one on your team. Go out and find an immaculate creative director, one who has 3-4 production companies that can shoot the TV commercial, and let that person, that when the brief comes to you, you sit in the brainstorm all you want, but you let that person drive it, because there's a way how, if you want to compete with the guys we have now and take your shot, you are going to need a little something that you don't currently fully possess. Taking nothing away from you and your team, just saying that how many TV commercials did you guys shoot? Well, guess what? Not enough, right? Because we have these specialties and these skills, but you've earned the right to get the brief in the first place, because you have the evidence, you've got the spark, and we see something where we think you can do some special things for our brand. So in that case, what did I have to do? I'm getting in my phone book and I'm calling people all over the continent. And I'm saying, hey, actually, you've even reminded me right now. Like, there's literally oh my gosh, like, thank you. There's literally, I think, a creative director in Joburg. Oh, this is crazy, A.Lee. Like, oh my goodness. If I win this pitch, I'm coming to play this moment right back. This is my eureka moment. Because we were talking the other day, and I love their work. Let me tell you, man, South Africa, if there's one thing they have like, we're talking like global Cannes, titanium, like gold lion winning, like creative, at least on the continent. And taking nothing away from Kenya, I love Kenya, and we compete. So does Nigeria. But there's something with just South Africa where, like, I mean, some people like work in South Africa a couple of years and then literally get all expenses paid, relocation to London or to the Netherlands for global full service agency groups. So it's interesting to sort of see that. So for me, I think, to your point, the niche players, I think, we need to earn the right to be in conversations and in spaces that expand us. And the way you do that is really putting out your best work. And I think, knowing what you can and can't do, there's a self-awareness there as an agency owner. And I think when that's there, we get the chance to both play to our strengths. And I'm a real believer in like having an abundance mindset, right? There's no reason I can't, figure out A.Lee's background and be like, hey, A.Lee, I'm talking to, because like Safaricom, which is, I think it's a $10 billion corporation based here. It's a big telecoms company that's behind the mobile money, basically like, evolution globally and here, where I'm like, hey, I got this colleague of mine, A.Lee, and he's got his team in the US, and we're, jointly bidding and pitching for some stuff. Why? Because he's a specialist at some stuff globally in his niche and his domain. And, he's working, let's say, with, I don't know, T-Mobile and all these like American telcos. So I'm like, at least I know he's got my back, in that he can bring some of that expertise and I can help fill in the local nuance. So my mind is that this is what we call the global village, right? We should look at each other really as an exchange of commerce and business, because I really think business is a force for good, and we get the chance to impact people and really change lives through what we do.
This is a very meta moment, because I was just speaking to someone recently about the benefit of podcasting. And one of those benefits was being able to network with people in your industry, and also, fill the gaps of each other's companies. At the same time, you're providing information to your listeners. So right now, we're both feeding people who want to learn about marketing, people who want to hire agencies, people who want to understand agencies in the global marketing market. We're feeding them. They're learning from that, but we're also networking. You and I are. And you mentioned about the global networking amongst companies. That's my answer to the full service thing, because my company, I don't go back in the Wayback Machine, look at my website. I might have said the phrase at some point, but I don't think we've ever said full service. Like I said, I'm thinking now, but I don't think we ever have. But I do know we did other things. We used to do, for example, websites and graphic design. And we realized that, we're getting more and more clients on podcasts and videos. So let's niche down and do more of those and less of the others. And then as I meet other agencies like your own, we say, you know what? Mark's agency goes deep on this item. Plus, if we're partnered with him, then we can claim his 25, 30, whatever years experience instead of us saying, well, yeah, we can do it and have no way to prove it. And so I've done that with other companies. I have companies who, in fact, one of our initiatives is to look for agencies who claim full service, but don't do podcasting or don't do video, because we know we can help them say yes more often. Right. So when I talked to someone like you, I said, you know what, let's work together, because if you're in a meeting, if I'm in a meeting and someone asks for something in their bid and they say, do you do this? I want to be able to say yes, knowing I'm going to call up Mark 5 minutes later and say, hey, Mark, we got a situation here and we can do this, but you can do it much better. Let's partner. And it isn't like we're not presenting to the customer correctly. We're telling them that, yes, we have a network of partners. And instead of us playing the full service role and giving you a half product, we can pull together agencies of experts and truly provide you a full service solution, because we're all deep experts in those things. So I like the way you phrase that, because we do need to have this kind of village, so to speak.
Yeah, I think for us, the way that we look at it is we, at Nendo, what we say is we have sort of two types of teammates here. So we have what we call natives, right? So again, example of a village. So we're like, hey, we're natives. We live here. We show up sort of, a 9 to 5 or whatever, and are like, you're going to find us around. And then we have what we call nomads. So nomads we got like a couple nomads in different cities of northern Nigeria. We have a nomad in Abidjan in the Ivory Coast. We got sort of about three of them in Accra in Ghana. We have about 5 split across South Africa, from Joburg to Durban to Cape Town. So when you start adding up, like, people are like, whoa, like, this is a pretty big team. I'm like, yes, but it's what I'd call nomads and natives. So we activate nomads, and some of them, honestly, they become like, a real core part of the team, because they'll be on, let's say, for essentially 2 weeks out of a month, especially on certain projects. So it feels like they're part of the organization. And then on the other side, you have basically the natives who are keeping everything together and running a tight ship, and we're slowly expanding that over time. So I think that's a valuable way to consider this future model, is saying, look, there's going to be that core. And COVID also taught us this, because we're remote too. So every day we have this, this daily huddle for like 10, 15 minutes. Everybody's saying what they're doing, and they dial in from wherever they're at. And that's the exciting thing about it. Like you said, it's like 5 minutes later, I'm calling you, putting you on as a nomad, and next thing we know, we got some business to do.
Absolutely, man. Wow. Well, Mark, it's been a complete pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to talking with you more and developing a relationship. I like what you're doing. And so before we go, please tell us anything about what you're working on right now, or maybe how we can find you or your company.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things I'm really passionate about that I appreciate the opportunity to plug. So thanks, A.Lee. So if you'd like anything on our website, so you're thinking about Africa, you're thinking about social listening or social media data, that's one of the sort of the things where like probably elite at on the whole continent at is social media data, where we compete really well on research broadly. And then, like I said, on the creative side, we're good. We're running some really special campaigns. We've won a number of awards, but I'm always hungry to get better. So our website, www.nendo, that's nendo.co.ke. That's the, so nendo.co.ke, that's the URL. So we've got like case studies, we've got free trend reports. Like, for example, if you're just looking to understand how Kenyans use their mobile data, like, one of the few, actually it's the only country in the world where Netflix is free is Kenya, right? Exactly. So you pay for Netflix where you are, we get it for free, but there's a couple like catches. So there's, even Netflix has said, look, of all the countries in the world, 200, something, whatever, like, we're going to go innovate in Kenya. So if somebody's looking for that sort of innovative research, we have free reports on our website for that. The other thing I'll quickly plug is the elections are coming, and misinformation, disinformation is a big thing here. So we have an online quiz. It's just about to launch, called Stop, Reflect, Verify. So it's at stopreflectverify.com. So just really excited to just have, anyone give us some feedback if you have some ideas. What I'm always saying is, you have listeners here, and if you're listening to this, you have experience, you have ideas, you have something to offer, reach out. Like, I'm again, abundance person. You could be in whatever country you're hearing this, treadmill, sort of like driving somewhere. And I would just love to connect, because I'm always hungry to build my network and and to have an exchange of ideas about what the next decade holds. And I think Africa is really the place to be. So happy to make your acquaintance and share.
Definitely. I'm excited. So great. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Mark. And thanks to our listeners. If you're listening to the podcast and want to see Mark and I, video the podcast and others should be available in the podcast section of contentmonsta.com. Thanks again, Mark.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Business of Marketing podcast, a show brought to you by ContentMonsta.com, the producer of B2B digital marketing content. Show notes can be found on ContentMonsta.com, as well as ALeeJudge.com. To continue the conversation, be sure to follow the podcast on your favorite podcast platform.